Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are tracing the absolutely fascinating journey of maple syrup. We're going to follow it all the way from a quiet, frozen tree in the dead of winter right up to that rich, amber bottle sitting on your breakfast table. It all starts with a rather surprising question, right? How exactly does watery tree sap become liquid gold? We are talking about taking a raw, super thin tree fluid and transforming it into this incredibly rich, complex syrup. I mean, it seems completely improbable when you think about it, but nature, combined with a whole lot of human patience, totally makes it happen. To really wrap your head around just how remarkable this transformation is, we have to look at one staggering number: 40. Yep, 40. That is roughly the number of gallons of raw tree sap it takes to produce just a single gallon of authentic maple syrup. It's just a massive reduction process. Literally, every drop in that bottle is the concentrated essence of the forest, collected slowly, drop by tiny drop. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our chronological roadmap for small-scale maple syrup production. First, we find a maple tree. Then we add spiles. Next, we collect the sap, boil it down, and finally, finish and store the syrup. Section 1. Nature's sugary secret. This entire process relies heavily on some very specific natural conditions and the unique botany of the forest. Now, while you can technically tap a few different types of maples, the sugar maple is the absolute star of the show here. Why? Because it naturally stores a much higher concentration of sugar in its sap over the winter. You can actually identify them by looking closely at their branches. Maples have opposing leaves, buds, and branches, meaning they grow directly opposite each other in pairs, just like those sharp-pointed buds on a sugar maple branch. So nature is already doing half the heavy lifting for us by storing up all that sugary energy. But just finding the right tree isn't quite enough. You absolutely need the right weather, specifically a freeze-thaw cycle. This usually happens in that weird transitional window between winter and spring. When the temperatures drop below freezing at night, it actually creates a negative pressure inside the tree. It acts almost like a giant suction cup, drawing water up into the stem. Then when the sun comes out and the day warms up, that internal pressure increases, pushing the sap back down and out. Honestly, without this precise, rhythmic breathing of cold nights and warm days, a sap harvest is literally impossible. Section 2. Topping and collecting sap. Once that weather is dialed in perfectly, usually somewhere between February and April, we move into the next phase. This is where human effort meets the rhythm of the forest in a surprisingly delicate operation. Producers head out into the woods, drill a tiny hole into the tree, and insert a tap, which is called a spile. Now, the traditional method uses metal buckets hanging directly from those spiles. And sure, it's incredibly charming and gives you that classic, nostalgic aesthetic. But emptying those buckets by hand? Massively labor-intensive. So modern producers often use a different approach: sprawling networks of tubing that connect multiple trees together, gently guiding the sap downhill into large collection tanks. It's basically like installing plumbing right in the middle of the forest. But here is the crazy part. What is actually coming out of that tiny 5/16 hole? Well, if you were to taste it right there on the spot, you'd probably be shocked. Raw sap is about 98% water, and it is virtually flavorless. It just tastes like water with the absolute faintest, tiniest hint of sweetness. This incredibly watery starting point is exactly why we need to move on to the most intense part of the entire operation. Section 3. The alchemy of boiling. Welcome to the Sugar Shack. Making syrup is fundamentally about evaporation. We are initiating a massive thermodynamic transformation that drastically alters the physical state of that watery sap. You pour the sap into a large pan over a heat source, like a big roaring wood stove, and you just boil it. The general rule of thumb here is that for every single quart of syrup you want to make, you have to boil away about 10 gallons of water. This takes hours upon hours of rolling boils. The water evaporates as pure steam, filling the entire room with this sweet, absolutely incredible woodsy aroma. But how do you actually know when it's done? You definitely can't just guess. The sap officially crosses the finish line and becomes syrup when it hits a magic temperature, exactly 7 degrees Fahrenheit above the boiling point of water. But wait, here's the catch. Since water's boiling point actually fluctuates daily based on the barometric pressure outside, producers have to constantly test pure boiling water every single day, add 7 degrees to that specific number, and then carefully monitor their bubbling sap until it hits that exact target. So the crucial point is making sure that the sugar concentration is absolutely perfect, and this is measured in something called brix. Authentic maple syrup is officially defined as being approximately 67% sugar, or 67 bricks. Both hobbyists and professionals use a handy little tool called a refractometer to test the liquid. This confirms that the syrup has crossed that magic 67% threshold and has officially, legally transformed from watery sap into true maple syrup. Section 4. The chemistry of flavor. Now, all that heat and evaporation, they don't just change the texture, they completely change the taste. The boiling process initiates something called the Maillard reaction. If you aren't into cooking, you might know this. It is the exact same non-enzymatic browning process that makes a seared steak or freshly roasted coffee taste so incredibly good. In maple syrup, this reaction develops compounds called pyrazines. These aromatic organic compounds are the absolute primary drivers of flavor chemistry here, giving the syrup its signature roasted, cooked, and delightfully nutty notes. Let's look at how this builds with some other chemical compounds. Alongside those pyrazines, we also have phenolic compounds. These are heavily influenced by the climate, the soil, and especially how late in the season the sap is harvested. Phenolics are responsible for adding fruit notes, think really subtle hints of apple or banana. Then, as the heat continues to do its work, furfural compounds start to increase. These guys are responsible for adding that heavy, slightly acrid, deep caramel flavor. So the longer you heat it, the more intense those rich caramel flavors become. Section 5. Grades and unique pairings. And this brilliantly illustrates how syrup is actually categorized. It is graded by color and flavor, not by quality. In places like Canada, they use a device called a spectrophotometer to measure the exact percentage of light that transmits through the syrup. Early in the harvest season, you get this beautiful golden syrup with a very delicate flavor. But as the season progresses, the actual chemistry of the tree starts to change. This results in dark and very dark syrups that let way less light through. And because of those furfural compounds we just talked about, these darker syrups carry a much stronger, more robust caramel taste. Now, because maple syrup has such a wild, complex chemical profile, it pairs with everyday foods in ways that go way beyond just pouring it over pancakes. Scientifically speaking, those woody, brown notes in the syrup beautifully complement the natural sweetness of carrots. And if you are roasting Brussels sprouts, adding a little maple syrup actually lowers the vegetable's natural bitter compounds while boosting that delicious browning effect. Oh, and here is a really surprising one. Mixing maple syrup into sour cream actually lightens the tanginess, creating this lavish, rich profile that is absolutely perfect for topping a baked sweet potato. You gotta try it. So I want to leave you with this final thought. How will you view your next pancake breakfast, knowing the natural magic and the deep science behind every single drop? From the precise freeze-thaw cycles of the forest to the 40 gallons of raw sap required, all the way to the Maillard reaction, developing those rich pyrazines over hours of boiling. What seems like a totally simple pantry staple is actually a stunning collaboration between generations of human tradition and the beautiful rhythms of nature. Keep that in mind the next time you enjoy some of that sweet liquid gold. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.